Good morning and happy Friday. I'm Amber Duke and joined by my co-host Jessica Burbank today. Jessica, good morning.
I just wanted to get another day of rising in with you, Amber.
You just can't stay away. All right, we have a lot of news to get to today, as always, and we're going to start off with Vice President Kamala Harris meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday. The presumptive Democratic presidential nominee delivered remarks following the meeting, expressing her unwavering support for the existence of the State of Israel.
Now, Harris also underscored the need for a ceasefire in Gaza and expressed a forcefulness on ending the war.
So I just had a frank and constructive meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I told him that I will always ensure that Israel is able to defend itself, including from Iran and Iran-backed militias such as Hamas and Hezbollah. I have had an unwavering commitment to the existence of the State of Israel, to its security, and to the people of Israel. I've said it many times, but it bears repeating. Israel has a right to defend itself, and how it does so matters.
Now, Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, met with Harris after he spent almost 3 hours with Joe Biden. They were discussing a Gaza hostage and ceasefire deal. Netanyahu was reportedly disappointed with Harris's remarks after their meeting. One Israeli official said, quote, "We hope that Harris's public criticism of Israel won't give Hamas the impression that there's daylight between the U.S. and Israel, and as a result, make it harder to get a deal." The Israeli Prime Minister will meet with former President Donald Trump at his Mar-a-Lago estate today. It's their first meeting since Trump left the White House, and sources told CNN the meeting was requested by Netanyahu.
Joining us now to discuss is White House columnist at The Hill, Niall Stanage. Niall, good morning. Thank you for joining us. How problematic do you think this could be electorally for Kamala Harris? She has signaled public support for Israel, but also has, of course, suggested there should be a ceasefire. She also put out a pretty strong statement condemning some of the more violent protests that took place in the nation's capital earlier this week. Has she done enough to satisfy the Democratic base that is more pro-Palestinian on this issue?
You know, I think the electoral element of this issue is really complicated. I mean, people, of course, have very strong views on the morality of it in various ways, but electorally it has always been more complicated for Democrats than for Republicans, because most Republican voters are pretty strongly pro-Israel. And the Democratic Party, in terms of its voter base, leans pretty heavily more pro-Palestinian, but isn't without a pro-Israel element. And so I think you see Harris trying to sort of navigate her way through that. The criticisms of the protesters around Union Station here in DC, those were very strong criticisms. Then she, as you showed in the clip you played, both voiced support for Israel and pretty strong criticism of the way it has conducted itself in Gaza. That's an attempt to, as I say, navigate through the democratic politics of it. Those politics are pretty thorny, I think.
Harris finds herself in a really tough position with these pro-Palestine progressives that are considering whether or not to go with Harris. They're in the coconut army right now, which is equally part serious as is a joke. I'm not saying some people think it's a joke and others think it's serious. It's both at the same time for most of the people in this movement. And they want action on Gaza. And it puts Harris in a tough position because she right now is in the Biden administration, not the Harris administration. She's not in a position to deliver action. Do you think these words will be enough to bring in the youth vote?
I think they might be, Jess, if they are perceived as signalling a change. But the problem is exactly the one that you outlined, honestly. Kamala Harris is the presidential candidate at the same time as she's the sitting vice president. So she has no real power yet. I mean, you can argue that influence certainly is moving pretty rapidly toward her and away from President Biden, but it's not her who's setting the policy. So she has to, in a sense, wear a couple of different hats, as on one hand, the supportive vice president, and on the other, as the presumptive Democratic nominee. I think a lot of us assume she would move maybe one one or two notches more toward a broadly pro-Palestinian position, but that's just based on sort of trying to read between the lines at this point. It isn't based on any substantive policy change, because she doesn't have the power to make one.
Yeah, I wanted to dig into that sort of dichotomy with where Kamala Harris sits right now in terms of her positioning as we head into November, because she was the one who gave this speech shortly after the meetings between both herself and then Joe Biden with the Prime Minister. And she also is likely trying to demonstrate that she has some kind of foreign policy experience. That has been a weak spot in her previous presidential campaign, as well as her campaigns for Senate. So how exactly does she strike that balance without stepping on the toes of Joe Biden and giving the American people the impression that Joe Biden is basically acting as a lame duck president?
With great difficulty, I think. I just think that is an inherently difficult thing to do, whether one prizes Kamala Harris's political skills highly or not. That's just a difficult task that she has. And I do think its difficulty was shown in particularly stark relief yesterday, because on one hand, it seemed like she wanted those images of her, on the world stage. But then when Netanyahu's coming to visit, that's an image of you beside Benjamin Netanyahu, which is a very problematic image from the point of view of the Democratic base. I think that we do seem to be seeing her move into more of the sort of ceremonial's a bit unfair, actually, just more high-profile moments that she is participating in. The other thing that is very notable, Amber, is just how much more intense the attention is on her now. 2 or 3 weeks ago even, a vice presidential event was kind of a little bit of an afterthought, and you very rarely saw it on any cable news channel unless there was something dramatic happening. I was at the White House immediately after President Biden had stepped aside when she did this event, which was basically in celebration of college athletes, and there were, reams of press there. So she'll get the attention. The question is, does that rebound to her benefit or to her detriment?
It seems that a lot of people are holding on to hope that Kamala Harris will be different once she gets into office upon winning in November on Gaza. But there were protests across D.C. I went to a couple of them downtown. They were overwhelmingly peaceful. MPD was creating a line between a handful of counter protesters to, keep the peace, as they were, I saw on several occasions, getting into the pro-Palestinian protester space. There was some graffiti on a replica of the Liberty Bell that got the attention of many conservatives. Of course, the flag burning, which is a form of protest in the United States that is perfectly legal, I will say, under the First Amendment. But Kamala Harris did pen a letter and put it out as a PDF letter from her office. And this got the attention of some of the protesters. It got the attention of the youth. But I think it might matter that was a letter, and it was to satisfy maybe some of the more conservative members of the Democratic Party, some of the more pro-Israel members of the Democratic Party. But what she said in this speech, how she didn't make those same comments and echo what she said in the letter, do you think that matters? Do you think that signals a change, or are we really just grabbing at nothing here, Niall?
I think as much as we can read those clues, Jessica, it seems to suggest a bit of a change, but I don't think the people who were protesting, around Union Station and elsewhere across DC should yet take too much faith that a Harris presidency, if it arrives, is going to be a kind of free Palestine presidency. I mean, I don't think that's where she stands at all. I think she's trying to display, to a degree, greater empathy for the many, many millions of Americans and people around the world, for that matter, who find the suffering of the Palestinians just horrific and have real human empathy for it. But the letter that you noted was pretty strong, very much so, actually. Just not that anecdotal evidence is necessarily massively dispositive one way or another, but I went down to one of the protests, was speaking to a couple of attendees, including one young woman who said that she planned to vote for the Green Party candidate, even though she had mixed feelings because she wanted to vote for a woman who could be the first woman president, i.e. Vice President Harris. But she felt she couldn't do that unless Harris promised much more of a block on any US military aid to Israel in the future.
All right, Niall, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to be back with more Rising after this.
Vice President Kamala Harris just secured probably one of the most important endorsements she could get, the Obamas. Let's watch.
Kamala.
Hello. Hi.
Hey there.
Oh, hi. You're both together. Oh, it's good to hear you both.
I can't have this phone call without saying to my girl Kamala, I am proud of you. This is going to be historic.
We called to say Michelle and I couldn't be prouder to endorse you and to do everything we can to get you through this election and into the Oval Office.
Oh, my goodness. Michelle, Brock, this means so much to me. I'm looking forward to doing this with the two of you, Doug and I both, and getting out there, being on the road. But most of all, I just want to tell you the words you have spoken and the friendship that you have given over all these years mean more than I can express. So thank you both. It means so much. And we're going to have some fun with this too, aren't we?
Harris also got support from the cast of RuPaul's Drag Race this week. She became the first sitting vice president to appear on the show. Let's watch.
Hi, everyone. It's Kamala Harris. Each day, we are seeing our rights and freedoms under attack, including the right of everyone to be who they are, love who they love, openly and with pride. So as we fight back against these attacks, let's all remember, no one is alone. We are all in this together, and your vote is your power. So please make sure your voice is heard this November and register to vote at vote.gov.
Can I get an amen?
Amen! Now on with the show.
And remember, you better vote.
And in a push to capitalize on the memes and viral videos, Harris joined TikTok.
Madam Vice President, are you on TikTok?
Well, I've heard that recently I've been on the For You page, so I thought I'd get on here myself.
A new Axios Generation Lab poll found that in a Harris-Trump race, 60% of voters aged 18 to 34 years old would vote for Harris, while 40% would vote for Trump.
Now, Harris is definitely capitalizing on her momentum with the youth vote. Here's a glimpse at Harris's first campaign ad, which features Beyonce's Freedom song that quickly went viral.
We choose freedom.
Freedom, freedom, I can't move. Freedom.
Now, I think Kamala shows that while she looks younger than her age, she's definitely 60 years old, talking on speakerphone with the phone up to her head. She does not have as many wrinkles as other 60-year-olds, but she still has some boomer qualities, Amber.
Yeah, I gotta say, this to me feels like Hillary 2.0. This is trying to capture celebrity, trying to capture memes. This is giving Pokemon go to the polls. But there was nothing in any of these videos really about things that really matter to the American people. The only policy issue that she talked about in any of those was on the RuPaul's Drag Race appearance, where she talked about, again, Trump being a threat to democracy. And we know from the polling so far that democracy is barely a top 5 issue for voters. And when you look at the breakdown of who voters trust more on democracy, Trump usually outpaces or was outpacing Biden. We'll have to see what that matchup looks like against Kamala Harris. But Batya Ungar-Sargon had a good tweet, I thought, about this, where she said, "What's wild about this call," referring to the endorsement from the Obamas, "is there's nothing about the American people. It's all how proud the Obamas are of Harris and how grateful and excited she is. It's a performance of celebrity friendship replacing politics, policy, or any thought of the struggling American electorate."
Now, I think Kamala's speeches on the trail, she's been stumping pretty hard. I've been watching her speeches in North Carolina and her speech in Wisconsin. She was very focused on combating one Project 2025. We don't know a lot about Trump's platform, which is interesting because he's been in office before and he's been running for much longer than Kamala Harris. But I feel like I have a better sense of the type of presidency we'd get from Kamala, because while we do have Project 2025 and it was written by 6 of his closest aides when he was the president, He's said that that's not his plan. And so I have a big question as to what it is, because we've had Kamala Harris talk about lowering taxes on middle and working class Americans, resisting the talks of cuts to Social Security and Medicare, talking about ushering in, green energy in a way that Joe Biden began, but didn't quite go to the extent to a lot of Democrats wanting to see that industry take hold. And so, yes, the first campaign ad, we're getting a lot of vibes-based stuff. It's good to set the scene for what the vibe of the campaign is. But it seems that in her rallies that don't get as much of a viral moment, she is focused on policy. And I think I'd like to see her use her TikTok to communicate those policies, because Hillary's big problem was she was in on the joke. She was trying to make the joke. With Kamala, it's Kamala HQ, it's her staff, it's people who support her campaign. The Coconut Army was an organic online movement. Brat Summer was organic as well. But the moment she touches that and starts producing that kind of content herself, it will become cringe in the same way as Hillary. So she's toting a fine line, and I hope we get those policy videos on TikTok. Kamala, if you're listening, it's an open book test. I'm not the first one to say it.
Yeah, just to get to a little bit about Trump's agenda and what his policies are, because you said you haven't seen much of it outside of Project 2025, which he says is not his. He does have Agenda 47, which is on his website. It's donaldjtrump.com/platform. Agenda 47. You can read all about his policies on there. He also spoke for 90 plus minutes at the Republican National Convention, at least an hour of which was dedicated to what he viewed as being important in his second term. So I just don't think it's accurate to say that he hasn't shared what a second Trump term would look like. He also did a long-running or a long-form Time interview a couple of months ago where he was asked about a lot of policy questions, specifically on immigration. And on the question of Project 2025, I think it's interesting that the left has focused so much on this, because it's basically the equivalent of telling people to Google the Center for American Progress. It's just a conservative, right-leaning think tank that has come up with a platform that it would like to see in a future administration, and then has created a database of individuals who might staff that administration. This is no different than what any left-leaning think tank in Washington, D.C. does on a regular basis. The only reason that Project 2025 is getting attention is because this is the first time that a conservative think tank has actually been somewhat organized in a way that is comparable, I think, to the left.
Yeah, I think having 6 folks who are his cabinet secretaries be the authors that pen the 90-page document is making people pay a little bit closer attention to it and associate it with Trump more than maybe other think tanks and other publications, ones on the left as well. And so I think that's why. I've heard Trump's speech both at the RNC and his most recent appearance at his campaign rally, and I think that there's this thing that a lot of American voters like, and it makes sense because so many people in Washington are these elites. I've felt misunderstood by Washington my entire life. I mean, I remember when Wall Street was bailed out, and my dad, who built houses for a living with his own 2 hands, was struggling to keep our own. And that doesn't make sense, because you have these bankers that destroyed the housing market and they're doing fine. They're keeping their homes. And, I just never felt like Washington not only understood us, but had our best interests at heart. And so speaking to working class issues is something that Vance and Trump have really made a focus of their campaign. But I have not heard what the plan is or the impact is around making life better for working people. Understanding the issues is good. And I think a lot of voters look for that. But I think we're at a point where, sure, you can give lip service to the issues, but how will we fix them? What is the solution to them? And I don't think a lot of average American voters are reading campaign policy platforms on the website. Communicating that in person over video and over voice is really where we're at now when it comes to reaching voters. So I think that's why Kamala has to do it. That's why Trump has to do it. That's why RFK Jr., he's been doing it, I think, more than these 2 candidates and even Biden before it was Kamala, to be honest with you. And so I think the reason they're not doing it is because being non-committal to policy makes it easier to get in public office and fight for corporate interests like we've seen the Uniparty do for so long. I think candidates like RFK Jr. and pressure from young voters is what's going to make the difference and get these people to really talk about policy and make commitments.
Yeah, policy talk is, of course, important. I think that's why the American people, when polled, say that they trust Trump more on the economy, trust him more on immigration, trust him more on crime, and basically all of the top 5 to 6 issues for voters on the with the exception of abortion. But I would also say, going back to the comparison between the Heritage Foundation and the Center for American Progress, and the point that you made about how there are 6 former Trump officials who were working with the Heritage Foundation on the policy document that is with Project 2025, I would point out that there were a lot of people from the Center for American Progress that went to work for the Biden administration, including John Podesta, who was a founder of the Center for American Progress. He was one of the energy czars that Biden brought on board. Neera Tanden was the Center for American Progress's president from 2011 to 2021. She was brought on as a senior advisor and staff secretary in 2021. There are emails between fellows at the Center for American Progress and the Biden administration where they're talking about policy issues and potential policy platforms and prescriptions that the Biden administration would put in place. So all of these supposed connections between the Heritage Foundation and the Trump campaign are things that exist with left-wing think tanks and the Biden administration. So I just am not catching the difference here, except for the fact that it appears to be an attempt to fearmonger that Trump is going to take every single bullet point off of Project 2025 and implement it into his administration. It is not atypical at all, again, for a conservative-leaning think tank or a left-leaning think tank to communicate or coordinate to some extent with an incoming administration that likely agrees with them on some, maybe not all of the issues.
Yeah, I think Trump has his work definitely cut out for him, because saying things like, I agree with some of it, but not all of it, and people seeing things like getting rid of the Board of Education, making cuts to Social Security and Medicare, policies that they really care about, they're worried that maybe those are the ones he likes. And maybe the other stuff in Project 2025, the stuff that he doesn't like, is stuff that they haven't read about yet. And I think he's going to have to address the thing people are most concerned about, making a commitment around whether or not he plans to cut Social Security and Medicare once in office. He talks a lot about how they're going to reduce the deficit and have a surplus and all of these great fiscal promises. You know, I don't think they're great. I think it's a misunderstanding of macroeconomics, but that's what he's promising. And whenever we talk about austerity in America, there's always a conversation around Social Security and Medicare, and that's something Republicans have talked about as well. So I think he really is going to need to make clear the things about Project 2025 that have been in the media that people are afraid are a part of the conservative agenda. He's going to have to address those to get over this Project 2025 hurdle. And J.D. Vance talking about it as well is just bringing more and more attention to it. And so I think as long as he addresses Americans' biggest concerns around overstepping the bounds of the executive branch, him potentially cutting the social safety net, one that J.D. Vance relied on to get where he is today, they're going to have to address the biggest concerns in order to get over this.
Yes, and Vance has been very clear that he does not want to get rid of the social safety net, and this is actually one of the reasons why the Republican establishment, meaning the supposed fiscal conservatives who are not in line with the populist reinvention of the Republican Party, were very upset when he was chosen as the vice presidential pick for Trump. Vance in 2023 went on War Room with Steve Bannon and said this: "There are people who would cut Social Security, throwing our grandparents into poverty so that one of Zelensky's ministers can buy a bigger yacht. Kiss my ass, it's not happening." So I don't think you can get any clearer than that. We're going to have to leave it there. We'll be back with more after this. Republican vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance is apparently in hot water. Trump's VP pick tried to distance himself from Project 2025, a right-wing blueprint for the next Republican administration. But his previous remarks about it might make that difficult. Take a look.
You asked about Project 2025, and I want to be clear here that Trump explicitly has said his own transition team runs the Trump transition and will run the Trump administration. Again, you have a whole host of organizations, some of which have good ideas, some of which have bad ideas, and some of which have both. And I'm sure the Trump administration will talk to a lot of people as it's crafting an agenda. Most Americans couldn't care less about Project 2025. I reviewed a lot of it. There's some good ideas in there, Rob. Most Americans couldn't care less about Project 2025.
And if his words weren't enough, this latest revelation has made it almost impossible to put distance between him and Project 2025.
It turns out Vance wrote the foreword for a forthcoming book written by Project 2025's architect, Kevin Roberts. According to the book's Amazon page, in the foreword of the book titled Dawn's Early Light, Taking Back Washington to Save America, Vance writes, "Never before has a figure with Roberts' depth and stature within the American right tried to articulate a genuinely new future for conservatism. We are now all realizing that it's time to circle the wagons and load the muskets in the fights that lay ahead. These ideas are an essential weapon, J.D. Vance." So, in a time of unity, in a time of an attempted assassination, we just can't escape the violent rhetoric, Amber. It's like all we've got. Even talking about violence, we're like, we've got to fight violence. It's just in our vocabulary. It's in our blood as Americans. I don't know what's going on with that. But the Project 2025 stuff, obviously very central right now. J.D. Vance seems to be entrenched in it quite a bit. The Trump campaign has a task before themselves if they decide that they're going to stay the course and keep their distance from Project 2025. I'm guessing your take is that a lot of people are friends on the right and that it's a coincidence that Vance and Roberts are friends here and that he wrote the foreword.
I mean, actually, yes. I think when people talk about this like vast right-wing conspiracy in Washington, D.C., it's neither as vast nor as right-wing as they try to make it out to be. And the reality is there are not a lot of conservatives in this town. And so we do tend to be friends with each other. I don't think this is a secret or a surprise. I mean, even if you just look at the forewords that Tucker Carlson has written for any number of conservative books that have come out in the past couple of years, what people also don't realize is that these forewords are usually done even before the book is finished or before the person reads the manuscript. It's more of just a favor to a friend than it is anything else. But yeah, I genuinely don't understand. I know we talked about this in another segment, all of the hand-wringing about Project 2025. It's no different to me than any left-wing policy platform at a think tank, of which there are many in DC, whether it's the Center for American Progress or the Brookings Institution. This is precisely the same thing. This is what they are tasked to do. This is what donors give them money for, is to come up with policy prescriptions so that if somebody who's ostensibly on their side gets into the White House, they have some kind of roadmap that hopefully they'll take up and use when they get into office. But of course, there's no guarantee of that. Any administration is going to have their own transition team that may or may not come from those think tanks. They're going to have people who are creating policy who may or may not have connections with those think tanks. And there is always a level of independence there. They're not required or mandated to take Project 2025, pick it up and put it in the White House and say, this is what we're doing. And even so, there's a lot in Project 2025 that there is to like. I think one of the few things that has been harped on is reforms to Social Security and Medicaid in order to balance the budget. J.D. Vance has been very clear that he does not want any cuts to these programs. They were programs that were hugely helpful to his family when he was growing up. He's also advocating for making birth free so that women who have children do not have to pay these exorbitant hospital fees just for having a baby in a safe environment. He has talked about the fact that he wants to increase the child tax credit, which amazingly has actually sparked disapproval from members of Kamala Harris's campaign. We have Amar Musa, who is the director of rapid response for Kamala Harris, saying that J.D. Vance's attacks on childless Americans are vile. He called for higher taxes on those without children. Well, I hate to break it to Amar Musa, but we already have benefits for people who have children in the tax code. Again, they're called child tax credits, and pretty much everyone universally agrees that it's a good idea to incentivize people to have families. Meanwhile, Ann Applebaum admitted that the only reason that she and her friends are worried about Project 2025 is because of the reforms to Schedule F, which would make it easier to get rid of civil servants who are behaving in a political manner in their positions where they're supposed to be carrying out the agenda of the executive. So all of this is, to me, just an attempt at fear-mongering because they know that Trump is winning on the issues. So they're trying to create this fake issue to have people basically looking at a shiny toy instead of paying attention to what the two candidates themselves are saying.
Yeah, I don't think we can say Trump is winning on the issues. J.D. Vance is someone who endorsed a 6-week abortion ban in his home state. He identifies as someone who's 100% pro-life. He said things like end abortion. And so as a woman in a country where abortion bans are not popular at the national level, I think about this as just like weird fringe, almost anti-women type rhetoric. I think that J.D. Vance's stances on a lot of women's issues is what earned Tim Walz calling him weird, and a lot of people who have these beliefs about abortion and about childless women weird. It's one thing to incentivize pregnancy, to say we want to make the conditions economically good so that money is never a barrier for any woman or family to make the choice as to whether or not have kids. As a woman, I want to have kids one day, and so I think that's a very normal feeling among women to want to have kids. But I do think it's weird when we're forcing women to carry babies, especially in a case of rape or incest. These are stances that J.D. Vance has. He supported a 6-week abortion ban in his home state. He identified as 100% pro-life. And I think that that just comes off as weird, and it's unpopular in the United States, and the polling shows that that's an unpopular stance. And so I think a lot of women are going to be turned off for J.D. Vance. He's going to be a liability for the Republican Party.
Yeah, I know that J.D. Vance so far has supported Trump's idea of leaving abortion to the states, which is obviously different than his personal opinion on the issue, which is a pretty moderate position to allow states to decide. That gets the issue closer to the voters. It's also something that's supported by the majority of Americans, as is a 15-week ban on abortion. So you could say he's probably more pro-life than the average American, but based on what the Trump administration, or rather the Trump campaign, has said they want to do, they're pretty in line with the American electorate. The Kamala campaign has also been putting out all of these old quotes from J.D. Vance, claiming they're leaks that are supposed to be damaging to him, when they're really just things he said publicly on podcasts or on Fox News or what have you, where he talks about the ethical ramifications of basically women traveling to states that don't ban abortions in order to get an abortion out of state, and basically what that looks like. It's been mischaracterized as him calling for a federal ban on women going to a different state in order to get an abortion, which, if you listen to the full thing, is not what he said. There's also been a lot of consternation about him talking about childless cat ladies, which, I mean, sorry, I kind of agree with him on this. I do think that allowing our national policy to be run by childless cat ladies is not the best idea. I think it's a good idea to probably have some people who have their eyes set on the future of the country for their children and grandchildren to have a stake in what we're doing and making sure that our policy works well for families as well. Families are the building block of society, particularly American society. And again, I don't think it's weird at all to say that that is the case.
I don't know. As a woman, I never go to a gynecologist who is a man. I kind of feel the same way about any man making policies about women's bodies, about our uterus, about having babies. So I actually would take a childless cat lady, as long as it's a lady, over someone like J.D. Vance or Donald Trump making policies. And what scares me personally about the prospect of a Trump presidency is he was given a chance on that debate stage to say, you know, no, I wouldn't sign a 6-week ban if it graced my desk. He didn't respond to Joe Biden's point when Joe Biden said, I would not sign a 6-week total abortion ban if it graced my desk, but he would. And Donald Trump never corrected and said yes or no on that. And so that really scares me, and I'm sure it scares a lot of women.
Well, he did criticize Florida Governor Ron DeSantis for signing a 6-week ban, so I'd imagine that is pretty clear on where he stands on that issue. But I know we're going to continue to follow both of the candidates' views on abortion, particularly as Kamala Harris is now the presumptive nominee. We'll be back with more Rising after this. In what has been described as, quote, an attack on France, France's high-speed train lines were targeted by multiple malicious acts just hours before the opening ceremony for the Olympic Games kicks off this afternoon. French President Emmanuel Macron is not only dealing with citizens' disrupted travel, he's also focused on keeping politics out of the Olympics. Macron has called for a, quote, political truce around the world for the duration of the Olympic Games. But that message doesn't seem to have resonated with protesters. Pro-Palestinian protesters already gathered Tuesday in Paris to demand the International Olympic Committee exclude Israel from the Olympic Games. This is not unprecedented, actually, following the invasion of Ukraine. After all, the IOC banned Russia from all team sports at the Paris Games, and the 15 individual Russian athletes who qualified and applied for entry must compete as individual neutral athletes.
As a reminder, athletes are banned from expressing their political views during official ceremonies and competitions, but that does not stop athletes from talking politics at press conferences, which is exactly what happened with Team USA men's basketball yesterday. So Steph Curry and Steve Kerr both expressed their support for Vice President Kamala Harris. Let's watch.
Yeah, very interesting time for our country for sure, and the fact that President Biden gave that endorsement and Vice President Harris is primed to bring her energy to this campaign and hopefully if she's on the ticket winning the election, like it's a big deal to say the least. And she represents the Bay Area. She's been a big supporter of us, and so I want to give that energy right back to her. And just excited knowing, obviously, we're representing our country here, and this is a very monumental next couple months for our country and the direction that we're headed. So hopefully this is a great way to do our part to continue unifying the country with how we, sports brings a lot of people together. And for her in this moment, knowing what's ahead, like we're just all about positive energy and optimism.
Now, the last time I remember politics and sports converging, LeBron James was told to shut up and dribble. There was all kinds of responses, but I think we're at a different political point in this country. And yeah, people expressing their political views on the platform they have is definitely more normalized. Politics, I think, when it was something that you don't talk about it at the dinner table, we don't discuss it, we were at probably a worse political place. I think now that we're more open about the issues, economic issues especially, even in France, they're talking about how ridiculous it is that their country has put so much money into hosting the Olympics and cleaning up the Seine River so that they can host swimming events in it. And they're like, hey, we live here all year. We're the citizens of France. Don't we deserve a clean river? You're just cleaning it up for the company. I think it's a good point to make that everyday people deserve to have a clean country too. That investment is worthwhile 365 days a year, whether the Olympics are being hosted there or not. So there's a lot of politics inherently around the Olympics. It's every country in the world sending athletes to compete for greatness. That's kind of political in itself. And so I think it makes sense to let the athletes talk about politics in their press conferences and, keep the ceremonies to, sports stuff. But there's a very famous photo from an Olympic ceremony in the past that is very political too. So maybe they're trying to avoid that around the Palestine movement.
I agree with you that people have sort of been primed now to expect political opinions from athletes. I'm not sure whether that's a good thing or not. I think generally speaking, it's good to have things in culture and society that are not overtly political, even if there happen to be political undertones. It's nice to have escapes sometimes from these very fraught issues that can be very divisive in our culture. And sports used to be one of those things, at least from the 60s, I would say, or the 70s to the 2010s. And now that so much of our entertainment has become politicized, I think that's actually contributed to the division in our country because people can't talk about pretty much anything without having some political opinion inserted into it, which naturally ends up leading people, even within their homes, their communities, to argue with one another. And it causes us to really view each other as the enemy. Like, this isn't just someone who thinks that LeBron James is better than Kobe Bryant, but also maybe someone who agrees with LeBron James's political opinions. And I think that can become very toxic. So it's nice to have, I think, the Olympics generally be a place where it's just about national pride and rooting for Americans because we have that shared history and that common element to our existence.
Yeah, I feel like two things are true at once with the Olympics. On the one hand, there's so many problems, there's so much turmoil in the world, domestically, internationally. People are thinking of a million political issues a day. And it feels weird to be like, let's all get together and play with the ball. It feels weird. And it can be true that you also want to say it's okay to have fun. It's okay to turn the politics off for a minute. It's okay to do this tradition that we've done for very many years and compete against each other in sports. I love athletics. I was an athlete. And I feel both of those things at the same time. Like, you don't have to pick a side on those things. And I agree with you about talking about politics. I guess I say that because my family talks about the issues, and I think issues are political. Like, can we afford, to pay the bills? That is a political issue, and you can talk about it without coming at it from right versus left, just talking about it as people dealing with this thing. And I think the more people identify with a particular political tribe or team, if you will, if we're talking about sports, I think that's what leads to so much tension. I've heard about families just disowning each other because someone's a Trump supporter and the other is someone who supported Joe Biden. And that's really sad that that can tear apart families. But I do think it's good when people talk about issues. That is talking politics, but without talking about partisan politics. And I think that is good. But when it's just my team versus your team, that's not very helpful as well. So we can learn a lot from comparing sports to politics, I guess, Amber.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I would say that, sports in many ways used to be sort of an outlet for that sort of competition when people identified with different teams and cheered their teams on. And it was a way more to bring people together because it was a very low stakes kind of competition, city versus city or state versus state. But the worst thing that happens when your team loses is you're disappointed for a couple of days and then you gear up for the next season. Politics feels more high stakes now. And so when that team element replaces the team element of sports or other ways that we sort of compete in a sort of friendly manner between states and localities and communities, that ends up leading to this very fraught atmosphere where that person's not just, a Red Sox fan and I'm a Yankees fan, but they're actually supporting a team that could actively hurt me and my family.
I love how we're getting philosophical with this block. Like, what does it really mean, Amber? But
I guess I just don't have strong feelings about Steph Curry endorsing Kamala Harris because it's like, okay, of course. It just is not surprising to me.
Yeah, I think it's fine. I don't think it's going to influence a lot of people. I've heard people say that when the pandemic hit and like competitive sports wasn't happening as much, people decided to cling to politics as like, this is my team and that's your team, because they really wanted that team identity. But I also think there's this factor of people voted one way or another. Maybe they're a lifelong Democrat, they're a lifelong Republican. But as the economic conditions in our country got worse, and as different regions got culturally different and people started living in silos, now you're in the team, and it is, the stakes got higher because conditions got worse. That's how it is. And so I think that made the political divisiveness that much more intense. And so the conditions changed around a political environment where there was a two-party system, which is just a recipe for divisiveness. But I think people are slowly starting to realize that, working people in America, middle-class people in America have a lot more in common than the elites in America. And as we see people criticizing big monopolies, and, some conservative members of the Republican Party are not so happy that J.D. Vance has said he likes the actions of the antitrust division of the Biden administration. But I think that's good, and I think that's the result of working people talking about issues as they exist. Am I confident the Trump administration will appoint someone who's really tough on antitrust? Not yet. No, actually. But I think it's good that the voters are moving in that direction and the population of America is moving in that direction, regardless of what the two-party system looks like and how much they're trying to divide us.
Yeah, I'd also point to, in addition to the economic conditions in the country, but specifically the pandemic as a big driver of this siloing of communities. We were banned from going to church, banned from playing at the local park, and all kinds of other ridiculous lockdown restrictions that really isolated us from our fellow Americans and allowed us to celebrate the fact that even though we're different in a lot of ways, we also have a lot in common. When you don't see someone on a regular basis, or you're not active in your community and maybe you only communicate online through social media, those things that are different between you seem to get a whole heck of a lot more important than the things that unite us. And I hope that the Olympics can be a somewhat politics-free rallying point for Americans to have a little bit of national pride. But I suppose I'm not optimistic at the same time, just given what we've talked about with the increased politicization of sports. But I know I'm going to try to watch as much of it as possible. I'm sure our viewers are too. Let us know in the comments which events and athletes you're really rooting for, and maybe some of them are the same as ours. We'll be back with more Rising after this.
California Governor Gavin Newsom has ordered California state officials to begin dismantling thousands of homeless encampments following the recent Supreme Court ruling that empowers cities to enforce bans on sleeping outside in public. The executive order directs state agencies and departments to develop, quote, clear policies to urgently address the issue. And for context, California has about 1/3 of the nation's population of homeless people. Newsom said there was nothing more frustrating and urgent than addressing the problem. Let's watch.
I don't think there's anything more urgent and more frustrating than addressing the issue of encampments in the state of California. Over the course of the last number of years, the state has stepped up, where in the past we provided no support, no resources to cities and counties to clean up encampments like this. Today, we've invested now over $1 billion in encampment resolution grants, not only to clean up sites like this, but to address the underlying issue in the first place. One of the big issues, though, that has been an impediment was the courts. In the past, the courts have denied the ability for local government, including the state, to clean up many of these encampments. Today, I announced an executive order to move the process forward. We're done. It's time to move with urgency at the local level to clean up these sites, to focus on public health and focus on public safety. There are no longer any excuses. $1 billion this state has invested to support communities to clean up these encampments. We have now no excuse with the Supreme Court decision. This executive order is about pushing that paradigm further and getting the sense of urgency that's required of local government to do their job.
Joining us now to discuss it all is Tenant Union Federation Director Tara Raghuvir. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So Newsom's really framing this as, we did everything we could. It's like he offered everyone a house and they said no, and that's why they're doing this. This doesn't seem like an issue you can throw $1 billion at in any direction and resolve. San Francisco, for example, has about 10% of the houses in the city vacant. They have 5 times plus the amount of vacant units as they do in a population experiencing homelessness. It doesn't feel like the resolution was relevant to the problem. What do you make of his move now?
So Governor Newsom's move is craven. It's inhumane. It also is ineffective, and it's not actually going to solve for the homelessness crisis in California. And other state and local officials would be wise to move in the opposite direction, because this is really not the solution to homelessness anywhere. We live in the richest country in the history of the world, and over 650,000 people sleep on the streets every night. Over 180,000 of those people live in California. And the solution to homelessness is not handcuffs. The solution is actually homes. And California has repeatedly fallen short of meeting the housing needs of people in its state, including building affordable housing supply, but also regulating the rent so that people can actually afford to stay where they live.
So we saw that a couple of years ago, especially during the pandemic in California, there was an effort to rehome some of the individuals who were living on the streets, mostly in hotels. And unfortunately, what ended up happening was the hotels fell into disarray because they were not treating some of the underlying issues involving these people, whether it's mental illness or drug addiction. So how does that factor into the equation of preventing homelessness?
Sure. There's degrees of homelessness, right? Some people are chronically homeless, and some are episodically homeless or maybe housing insecure and end up on the streets in their cars or doubling up with people in shared housing situations. Now, some people who live on the streets and are homeless are people who also have mental illnesses and they need some treatment and support. And instead of criminalizing those people, locking them up or moving them out of sight, we should be doing everything we can to care for them and to provide not only short-term housing and hotels, but actually permanent, stable housing and wraparound services to get them what they need to not just survive, but also thrive in those new circumstances.
I really think about this as just an economic failure on Newsom's part, and wherever it happens in America, a lot of people say, economists specifically and really centrist Democrats and Republicans, that the economy is good when, inflation is down and Wall Street has good projections for the future. I think the economy is good when people use it for what it's for. It's a system for people meeting their material wants and needs. It's a place where people work, money is exchanged, they build things, they provide services. And if one of the most basic necessities is not being provided for people who need it, it's an economic failure. And so how do we more clearly define this as an economic failure on Newsom's part or wherever it exists with some of the tenants that you work with that are maybe episodically homeless or housing insecure, or even chronically homeless? Can you point to clear economic failures that cause this?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the crisis that California faces in relationship to people living outside and sleeping on the streets is an indictment of the economic regime that both Democrats and Republicans have seen through across the country. And that's an economic regime that prioritizes profit over everything else, and specifically profit over people's lives. Real estate capital is one of the most potent forces in what we call the American democracy, right? But the real estate lobby controls almost every element of housing policy, and they've evaded regulation for years and years and years, to the extent that we see these types of economic failures all around us. It's what you described. There are 5 times more vacant units than there are unhoused people. And yet we can't design policy solutions to actually put people in homes because we're too busy prioritizing building new market rate housing and padding the pockets of already uber wealthy real estate investors.
You mentioned in one of your previous answers that you don't believe the solution is criminalizing homelessness. And while I agree to an extent, when it comes to the question of drug addiction in particular, we do know that perhaps facing criminal consequences does incentivize people to go into treatment facilities. And otherwise, I mean, obviously you can't force people to go get treatment, whether for mental illness or drug addiction. So what are some other ways that we can incentivize people to go into programs when they do need treatment, but maybe aren't capable of saying yes themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, to your first point, the evidence suggests that sweeping encampments and displacing people, punitive measures are by and large ineffective. There's actually nothing that proves that that is an effective way of dealing with homelessness or treating mental illness or pushing people to seek treatment who otherwise might not have. The big question I have about Newsom's order is, where are these folks supposed to go, right? Where are people supposed to go when they're displaced from their encampments and their belongings are dismantled? I'm no mental health expert, but that doesn't seem like the best path to put people in a place to stabilize and become healthy if they are not healthy. Now, what I will say is that I think there are amazing service providers out there whose roles need to expand, and they probably need more support to meet people where they're at and provide both harm reduction support and also support for people who are interested in seeking treatment to do so, and to do so from their own volition and not from a place of punishment by the state. I think it's a really slippery slope, actually, if we say that the state is going to get to determine people's mental fitness to the extent that they get to push them into some kind of treatment that they may or may not have chosen for themselves.
Earlier in the show, we watched a clip of Kamala Harris at RuPaul's Drag Race where she told people, your vote is your power. I think power can come from many places, in a time when a lot of people are talking about electoral politics. And this is an issue that both sides have failed to address as it exists and systemically. Where do you see people finding power in resolving this? Is it tenant unions? Are there avenues for people to address, the greed they're seeing from landlords across the country, corporate landlords too? It's going to take a long time for Linda Khan to address the antitrust concerns there, but immediately, what can people do?
Yeah, absolutely. People are finding power in tenant unions across the country. I think increasingly there's a reckoning that everyday people are having in relationship to their monthly bills, right? Rent is the biggest bill that most of us pay every month, and the rent is too damn high. It has been for a long time, and people are fed up. And something's got to give. So people are starting to organize in tenant unions. Unions are starting to organize among each other nationwide. We're building something that's bigger than the sum of its parts. And I should add, too, that unhoused people have organized in similar ways for decades. Here in Kansas City, just a few years ago, the homeless formed a union across encampments, and they staged an encampment actually on the lawn of City Hall for more than 2 months. And that resulted in some of the, similar commitments where they ended up in sort of short-term housing situations in hotels. The city made really big promises, and then the city never kept those promises. And unfortunately, many of those people are back on the streets today. But I think that story is actually representative of the truth, which is that power for the most marginalized in our society often won't come at the ballot box, and it will come when they get together and they start to take collective action.
All right, Tara, thank you so much for joining us today on Rising. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Kamala Harris challenged Donald Trump yesterday to a debate. Here she is speaking to reporters.
So many of you have been asking me about the debate, and I'll tell you, I'm ready to debate Donald Trump. I have agreed to the previously agreed upon September 10th debate. He agreed to that previously. Now it appears he's backpedaling, but I'm ready. And I think the voters deserve to see the split screen that exists in this race on a debate stage. And so I'm ready. Let's go.
Now, on a call with journalists earlier this week, Donald Trump rather, said he would debate Harris multiple times, saying, quote, "I would be willing to do more than one debate, actually." So what's going on? Since then, there's been chatter about him backing out of the debate with Harris. The Trump campaign said Thursday Trump would not agree to a debate until Harris was named the official nominee. In a statement on X, the campaign said, quote, "Given the continued political chaos surrounding Crooked Joe and the Democrat Party, general election debate details cannot be finalized until Democrats formally decide on their nominee. It would be inappropriate to schedule things with Harris because Democrats very well could still change their minds." In response, Harris took to X, writing, quote, "What happened to anytime, any place?" Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg called Trump out on Morning Joe. Let's watch.
Tough talk is this guy's calling card. And now there's this extraordinary show of weakness. He agreed to, he said anytime, any place. But more than that, he agreed to this specific debate on this specific network on this specific date. And now he's pulling out. And of course, it shows that he's afraid. It shows that he knows if the two of them are on a stage together, it's not going to end well for him.
Now, tough talk from Donald Trump. I had similar thoughts when I saw this. I think that if that's the logic going into his refusal to debate Kamala now, but promising to in the future, I just don't know why he would have debated Biden if Biden wasn't the nominee either. I can understand that there's some conspiracy theories that maybe Donald Trump believes in. I heard Vivek Ramaswamy echoing some. I've read a lot on Twitter about people thinking Michelle Obama is going to end up getting the delegates at the convention and secure the nomination. I think we're going to see Kamala Harris be the official nominee of the Democratic or Democrat Party, as Trump would say. But I would just like to see a debate anyway. They promised us one. I feel like pulling out is weak sauce.
I have no doubt that they're going to debate. This is obviously meant to draw attention to the fact that this is fundamentally an anti-democratic process that the Democratic Party is presiding over. The difference between Biden and Kamala is that Biden got 14 million votes from the Democratic primary electorate, which means that the delegates were essentially obligated to vote for him come convention time. This is a fundamentally different thing, which is a coronation by the party elite. And so I think it's totally reasonable to draw attention to that, to point it out by saying that they have to wait until the convention to see what the delegates actually do in terms of allowing Kamala Harris to be at the top of the ticket. Of course, that's 90% likely, if not higher, to happen, but that is the appropriate point at which to schedule the debate, which there was previously a debate scheduled in September on ABC. The Democratic convention is the second to last week of August. There is plenty of time for there to be multiple debates, even if they are not scheduled until after that convention happens. I just view this statement as basically in line with what they said when J.D. Vance was selected as the vice presidential pick, which was very prescient in retrospect, where they said that they were not going to schedule a vice president debate with Kamala Harris because it was not clear that she was going to be the vice presidential nominee. And sure enough, it was just a few days later that Biden dropped out of the race and Kamala was elevated to the top of the ticket as the presumptive nominee. And lo and behold, J.D. Vance was no longer able to debate her in a vice presidential debate. This is essentially the same statement, just pointing out some of the chaos within the Democratic Party and the anti-democratic process in which they decided to push Kamala to the top of the ticket.
Yeah, I think Kamala Harris getting 81 million votes in the last election, the most votes ever given to a ticket, knowing that she would be president if Biden stepped aside, being, second in command to the commander-in-chief. I think that as a leftist who is for Bernie Sanders, who's very critical of the Democratic Party for the anti-democratic stuff that's happened in primaries in the past, this one doesn't piss me off at all, simply because they were on the same ticket. We knew they were a pair, and 2/3 of Democrats wanted him to step aside, knowing that Harris would be the presumptive nominee. She's the only person who would be able to still use the campaign's $240 million that was raised. So, that anti-democratic stuff, just if the people critical most of the Democratic Party don't care about it, I don't think Republicans and the right will be able to convince Democrats that that's a reason that Kamala Harris isn't the legitimate nominee. There's an official legal process there that they're going to go through. She is going to become the nominee. She has delegates pledged to her that would guarantee her the nomination. They could change their minds. And Joe Biden, before he stepped down, said at the Democratic National Convention, the delegates that are supposedly pledged to me could change their minds. They could pick someone else. That's a part of our democracy. And so that's the official legal process. And that was even before he stepped aside. So that was the case when Donald Trump debated Joe Biden. So to me, this is Donald Trump is afraid of Kamala Harris. She's a prosecutor. She's been doing a very good job speaking and countering Trump's messaging. I think this is Trump's team buying time because they know they need some prepared talking points and prepared arguments to go toe-to-toe with someone like Kamala Harris, who can think pretty effectively on her feet.
So she did get 81 million votes as part of the Biden-Harris ticket 3.5 years ago. Since then, she's had actually the worst approval rating, even worse than Joe Biden, for the vast majority of the presidency, of the Biden presidency. She's been underwater more than Trump has in terms of her unfavorability rating. So I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that simply putting her to the top of the ticket is not the way a primary process should happen. I would also point out that, it's easy to be excited about Kamala when you're going from what was essentially a corpse to someone who's capable of reading a teleprompter. And I don't buy the fact that Trump is scared of Kamala, considering back in 2020, it was the second Democratic primary debate where Kamala Harris sunk her own candidacy by failing to respond to Tulsi Gabbard's attacks on her prosecutorial history. Her only sole moment during the debates that got her any press attention and got her above her 1% to 2% threshold that she was riding at for the majority of the primary was when she called Joe Biden a racist and then immediately proved that that was just a craven political attack, and she didn't really believe it because she had t-shirts ready to sell for $29.99 and ended up serving as the vice president to this man that she believed was a racist. Trump also, in the last debate, managed to knock out his primary competitor when he debated Joe Biden. Joe Biden ended up leaving the race just a few weeks later. So there's really no disincentive for Trump there's no incentive for Trump not to debate. He literally knocked out his opponent. Kamala has a history of being bad at debates. And she also has not yet, in her short time as the presumptive nominee, faced any difficult questioning. She has not done an unscripted interview. She has not done any unscripted press conferences. She's gone out and she's read off of teleprompters, and she's appeared on RuPaul's Drag Race. But she has not been tested like a candidate will have to be ahead of November. Granted, there's only about 100 days left until the election, but she is going to, at some point, have to go off script. And if history is any guide, when Kamala Harris goes off script and tries to appeal to Americans, it doesn't go well. This is why she is so unpopular, because people find her to be inauthentic. They don't like her very much. The DNC actually did a focus group with Kamala Harris, where they played videos from her and showed them to Democratic voters, not even just the general electorate, and found that she was deeply unlikable, that they did not believe what she was saying. They found her laugh off-putting. All of these things are going to come up the same way that they did in the 2020 primary. And even though she was the DNC's favorite back during that process, they were forced to abandon her. She had to drop out before winning a single vote in the primary, because it turns out that both her personality and her policies are not very popular. And I can't imagine that the senator with one of the most progressive voting records is going to be very well liked among the working class, which she needs to win the Rust Belt in order to have a chance at taking the White House.
Yeah, there's one thing I know about American politics, especially presidential American politics, is that a lot of people who end up becoming the president are people who have run a lot of unsuccessful presidential campaigns in the past. You know, Joe Biden is someone who's on the ticket, the top of the ticket, when the most ballots ever cast for someone were cast in 2020, and he lost 4 times. So I think I am unburdened by what has been when I look at Kamala's history, and just hopeful for the future and what she's going to bring to the table. What I've seen from her on the campaign trail so far is that she is quite good in front of a crowd of people. She's performing well off script. She's really learned to come in to her own and be herself and be comfortable speaking to people, which is a hard thing to do, to talk to people candidly when there's a lot of cameras on you, when every word that's being said is going to be scrutinized. And I think that's a big reason why Trump's afraid to debate. There's no reason he would say no to a debate other than that he's afraid. He doesn't want to talk about his policy platform. He doesn't want to see how it compares to what Kamala Harris has to say about it, or what the alternative is with the Democrats. And I think they're buying more time to try and test more messaging to come up with something they can say in a debate. There's no excuse not to debate. So he should just debate. It really makes him seem weak. And I say this as someone who's an independent and someone who has a lot of family members who I know will make their decision based on what they see in a debate and what they see in the next few months. And this is a move that people are just saying makes him look weak and makes him look scared. He's gonna need to debate Kamala Harris in order to get out of this hole, because I don't think the Democrats are gonna stop with that attack.
And there is going to be a debate, but it's going to be after Kamala Harris officially becomes the Democratic nominee, which is when it was always going to happen anyway, because again, the next debate was scheduled for September. The Democratic convention is at the end of August. There was not going to be a debate before that anyway. So once she's officially coronated or crowned, or whatever term you want to use, there's going to be a debate. The idea that Trump's not doing the debate because they're just saying that she needs to go through the process, I think is completely inaccurate.
He did say anytime, any place, though, and this kind of feels like only September 10th if she's the nominee, doesn't it?
Well, there's a debate scheduled for September, and then there was a debate that they were discussing for October as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are 3.
I don't know. I think anytime, any place means that if she calls on you to debate, you gotta say yes. It reminds me of the Zuckerberg-Elon Musk cage match that never ended up happening. Elon Musk was asked about that again at the Capitol, and he again said he would do it with Mark Zuckerberg, and it just feels weak sauce that we didn't get that either. I'm not saying I want a Kamala Harris, Donald Trump cage match. I just want them to debate each other, and I want to see it happen, whenever she wants it to happen, because he said anytime, any place. And then he started complaining, oh, well, I want it on Fox News. I don't want it on ABC. Dude, you said anytime, any place. He's kind of eating his words right now.
I disagree. I mean, he said that he would do the CNN debate with Joe Biden, where the rules heavily favored Joe Biden. He did anyway and ended up winning the debate. He has said he'd prefer the debate to be on Fox News, but he would still do the ABC News debate. And you can't just pull a debate out of thin air. It takes time for both of the camps to agree on the rules, for them to agree on the network. The network has to agree to all of this. They have to decide whether they're doing them through the Commission for Presidential Debates or not. So you can't just pull a debate out of thin air. And I think if the agreement was that they were going to do the one in September, then it shouldn't be a problem for her to get the nomination in August, and then they go and debate on September 10th on ABC. And I guess we will see on September 10th if that debate ends up happening and which one of us is right as to whether or not Trump is going to debate Kamala. We'll be back with more Rising.
Yeah, I will say the networks are not the ones saying no. Trump is the one saying no. And so the networks can't plan anything if he's saying no.
But he's not saying no, he's saying not yet. That's a difference.
True, which is different from any time, any place, which is also something he said.
Okay, we'll be back with more Rising after this. The ladies on The View are cheering on what they call Kamala's fired campaign, but they also have some advice for her. Let's watch.
He's extremely triggered. Listen, he thought he was going to run against Joe Biden. He was kind of riding high on this wave of doing better. And today, the first general election poll from Morning Consult came out that has Kamala Harris ahead of Donald Trump, and she's been in the race for like 5 days. The dynamics of the race are fundamentally shaken up, and I have to give her credit. I had wanted Biden to step aside and pass the baton. She wasn't my first choice because I was worried she was going to run to the left. And she is running a smart general election campaign message. Her message is the economy, paid family leave. She says the core focus of her campaign and presidency will be restoring the middle class. The one thing she does need to lean into and is capable of doing is the border. This is an issue that Republicans rightly have criticized her over, but she needs to articulate that her administration negotiated a border package that Donald Trump blocked. If she can do that, there's absolutely a path in these next 3 months for her to win. And I've got to say, this campaign is fire.
Anna Navarro ended up calling out the GOP for their vile attacks on Kamala Harris. Let's watch.
And I wish Republicans were doing that. We're making this about the issues, the real issues that America deserves a debate on. But instead, they are so triggered and so wacko. They are shooketh. They are out there saying vile, vile remarks about Kamala Harris. By the way, let's start with that. Let's pronounce this. Kamala, Kamala, Kamala.
Now, shooketh should not be a word that anybody says out loud. That's an internet word. These are people trying to be hip because they read things on the internet. And it's been a week of that, hasn't it, Amber? Between the brat stuff, the coconut army, that woman with a printout of Kamala HQ Twitter with the brat green on Jake Tapper. It's just a lot to take in. But I think The View has a weird centrist lean. And I think their audience is a very specific facet of America. I think it's suburban middle class people who like the uniparty, who like when everybody does kumbaya bipartisan legislation. And look, the bipartisan bill to address the crisis at the border was one that I think conservatives were going for until Donald Trump says, no, we can't have this happen under the Biden administration because people will think it's a win for Biden. I have talked to regular working Americans, and unfortunately, that is how things work. Because Roe was overturned when Biden was president, I have talked to many regular working people who believe that Joe Biden did that because he was president when it happens. So I understand why Trump believes that, but putting partisan politics over delivering on policy for the American people is not so good. Unfortunately, Kamala Harris is someone who on issues has been to the right of Joe Biden. The handling of the border crisis, hiring more Border Patrol agents, ensuring that the numbers of people crossing the border goes down because they are still cracking down and putting migrants trying to cross the southern border into detention centers, deporting more Haitian migrants than any administration of the past 10 years. These are some of the things that have happened under the Biden administration. And we're not really getting a clear answer as to what was Kamala and what was other members of the Biden administration. They're definitely going to have to sort that out. But I don't think it's smart to say, you know, we're the same as conservatives on the border. They just need to be on the message precise about what they were trying to get done in that bipartisan bill. but they're afraid to get specific about policy. And I think focusing on vibes, this is the election where that's not going to work.
Yeah, I think the view is a bit overly optimistic on Kamala's chances here. I think the reality is that what her elevation to the top of the ticket does is it puts us right back where we were basically the morning of that CNN debate, which was Donald Trump was still leading in all of the swing states just by a slightly smaller margin. And these post-election polls are not super useful because every time a candidate announces, they get a post-announcement bump. But prior to her announcement, every poll that had been done with a head-to-head matchup between Trump and Biden versus Trump and Harris actually had Trump performing better against Kamala Harris. That's going to be a problem for her once that post-announcement bump dissipates, and people are going to be taking a very hard look at her record because she has all of the baggage of the Biden administration's failures with none of the possible charm that Joe Biden might have had in 2020 that convinced Americans that he was going to be a return to normalcy, just old Uncle Joe, Scranton Joe. She doesn't have that same credibility with the working class, and particularly with unions that Joe Biden did when he was running for president. And she has a lot of positions that are very unpopular with the working class. And when she was the border czar, she didn't accomplish a whole lot, but we do know that she has rather progressive opinions on how to deal with illegal immigration. During one of the Democratic primary debates in 2020, she raised her hands on giving illegal aliens free health care. She also said that illegal crossing should be decriminalized. And she also wants to abolish ICE, according to her own words, and likened ICE agents to the KKK. In addition, she opposes fracking. She wants electric vehicle and other energy mandates that would be absolutely crippling in places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan, and has also talked about her prosecutorial record in really bizarre ways by simultaneously making it out that she is tough on crime when it comes to truant children and marijuana, but soft on crime when it comes to people who are rioting in the summer of 2020, which I think is the exact opposite of where most Americans stand on how they want to see justice doled out in this country. All of those things she's going to have to answer for as soon as she gets off of this wave of excitement via memes and doing teleprompter-led events. If there's any journalist worth their salt, when she finally sits down with them, it's going to be very difficult for her to weasel her way out of this. I mean, remember when she was appointed the border czar and then finally pressed on why she didn't visit the border, she gave this horrible answer about how she also hasn't been to Europe, which was a complete non sequitur and really turned people against her. We now have the media, though, covering for her, claiming that she was never actually the border czar, even though they all used that exact term 2 years ago. It's going to be a long 100 days, to be sure. There's a lot to examine about Kamala Harris's history and politics.
And if there's one thing I know about the next 100 days, it's that the ladies of the View are not representative of the American electorate whatsoever. And I think the American electorate is changing in some interesting ways. I think the youth vote matters more this election than ever. We saw an 11-point increase in turnout from 2016 to 2020 to about 50%. Now, what we've seen at the national level is about 66% turnout, which countries like Australia look at and they say that is abysmal, that is the amount of people who are of voting age that are participating in presidential elections in the United States. It's kind of crazy. But I think if we get the youth vote, which I fully believe is possible, up to that 66%, that could determine the election. So Kamala has some choices to make because all the while there's a lot of economic fear-mongering around her plans to ban fracking. Young people are considering that there will not be an economy at all unless we get global climate change under control and reduce emissions. And Biden has paired a lot of these progressive policies around the economy with these carrot policies, ensuring private companies are investing in green energy, but also having huge jobs programs. So I went and talked to workers in Nevada at Brightline West, one of the nation's first high-speed rail tracks. I believe it will be the first high-speed rail that will be completed. The administration ensured that that labor is all good paid union jobs. And the workers like that this is, number one, a good paying job, but that it's stable and it's a job that they'll have for a long time. So while there's these temporary, upsets in the economy when you ban fracking and people who are working in the fracking industry end up having to start looking for another job, they're making sure that there are other good paying union jobs available. Kamala Harris needs to say, I am pro-union. That means not picking someone like Mark Kelly, who is the only Democrat in the Senate who hasn't sponsored the PRO Act. It also means, on the Gaza front, not picking someone like Shapiro, who is someone who called peaceful protesters equivalent to KKK members. He made that comparison. These are two candidates that will lose her the youth vote. The youth vote has a better chance of determining the election than the conservative never Trump vote. You need to consider that the polling is done by likely voters, and young people don't typically pick up landlines. So if this is going to be a campaign that's run according to centrists in the polls, I think it's a campaign that Kamala will lose.
Yeah, we'll have to see what some of the newer polling says over the next couple of weeks as this post-announcement bump sort of dissipates. And I would also just point out that a lot of polls now are conducted online, not just on landline phones. So we have to make sure we're looking at a smattering of polls and not just one, which is why the Real Clear Politics average is usually pretty helpful, as is 538. We're going to continue to track those and let you know next week where things are at. But that's going to do it for us this week on Rising, and it was great being with you today, Jess.
It was good to be back for Rising Friday. I will see everyone on Monday. Have a good weekend, y'all.
Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we are now available anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Bye, y'all.